Here we have an Indian mutiny game, the Siege of Delhi, using black powder rules. This simulates the Indians trying to break the Siege of Delhi by the British forces before the main artillery train arrives. Here we see the British camp with the British still enjoying tea and crumpets before the attack begins. We see some of the British forces occupying the main ridge that the Indians need to get back from them to break the siege. British are well entrenched behind a series of walls and small fortifications, but hopefully these won't be too much of an obstacle to the attacking Indian forces. Here we can see some of the British artillery getting into action as the Indians attack. The British and Indian cavalry charge each other almost immediately, with the British trying to push back some of the advancing Indian infantry before they get to the fortifications. Here we can see the Indian advance on the right flank, a fairly massive attack that's going to be going in. Here they are with their supporting cavalry as well. Here's the Indian central position with their commander in his elephant there at the back, and the Indian left flank with their troops moving up in force in preparation getting to grips with the British forces. Here we see some Indian lancers moving up, and we can just see in the background there the British cavalry attack, trying to disrupt the Indian attack, which is unsuccessful. The Indian cavalry managed to push back the British lancers, and the British cavalry eventually is pushed back and broken by the advancing Indians. Much to the Indian commander's delight, and we can see him in his magnificent elephant, and here's the British commander on top of the hill watching the action. Here we see some British civilians getting increasingly worried now that the Indian troops are advancing in their direction, and the British start taking up position to receive a pretty much full-on assault along the entire front. Here we can see the Indian sepoys now moving up. A little bit confusing that both sides actually have Union flags, but hopefully we'll be able to get around that in the commentary. Here again we see the British on the ridge behind their fortifications, awaiting the attack, and here the Indian troops advancing in an attempt to push them off the ridge. Indians managed now to push back the initial British cavalry attack, continue their advance. The Indian cavalry now attack and attempt to destroy the remnants of the British cavalry that are pushed back through their own artillery positions, causing a lot of confusion, which allows the Indian troops to now get into hand-to-hand combat with the British and start pressing them quite heavily on the central position and try and break into their fortifications. Here we can see more Indian troops moving up in support, and some Indian lancers moving up in the background. India is now beginning to push the British back by starting to break down the fortifications and look like the siege is probably going to be lifted. And here we see the Indian artillery train arriving. They need to get up onto the ridge as quickly as possible as well, so that they can start bombarding any British reinforcements that may try and get onto the table and push the Indians back. And here we can see some of the artillery moving up in support of the Indian attack on the right flank, and some Indian cavalry in the central position moving up in support as well. Here we can see some more Indian troops assaulting the British fortifications, and the cavalry action still continues, the British managing to rally and attack back. And here we can see one of the main engagements across the fortifications, with the British just managing to hold on. Got a British brigade here arriving as reinforcements. They're going to be urgently needed to shore up the defences on the ridge. And some British artillery also arriving and getting straight into action. And British relief officer arrives, leading his troops in as quickly as he possibly can, and the Indian commander moving up, urging his troops forward. And here we see the British engineers and civilians manning the walls themselves in a hope to stem the Indian advance. And the last of the British cavalry eventually gets pushed back and is destroyed. Indians starting now to get a few successes against the British troops, and managing to push them back and destroy them in a couple of instances, leaving a few gaps in the line which the British will need to try and fill as quickly as possible. And here we can see some sepoys have now broken in to the fortification and are threatening the British flank. British reinforcements move up into position on their right flank, and another British regiment is sent up to the main ridge line in a hope to keep the Indian sepoys out. Unfortunately, one of the British reinforcing regiments is turned back and routes straight back off the table, and the Indians begin to pour into the main position and start pushing the British troops back just about everywhere along the line. Indian sepoys here now assault a British battalion and a British artillery unit up on the ridge, and here we can see the Indians breaking into the fortifications, and the siege now pretty much looks as though it's broken, and the Indians pushing on to a likely victory. Here we can see one of the commanders of one of the Indian flanks leading his troops forward, and now a massive hole appears up on the ridge line, with more British troops deciding that they've had enough and packing up and pushing off. And the Indian troops move up and occupy their positions and occupy the main ridge that the British have been using to besiege the city of Delhi. British right flank still managing to hold on, but with presser troops that you can see in the background, I don't think they're going to hold out for much longer. And then a Highland Brigade arrives at the very last in an attempt to save the battle, but unfortunately I think the British have suffered far too many casualties, and the Indians have now occupied the ridge, breaking the siege of Delhi, and the battle is declared a major victory for the Mughal Empire, and a dismal defeat for the British Empire. Hearts Volunteers Gamers Club would like to dedicate this game to our friend and wargamer Mark Copping, who unfortunately died on the day that we fought this game.